Hello there, Flip here, and today we have a collab where I talk with Mr. HGC over here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there, I'm Mr. Leech, aka Mr. HGC, and I make videos mostly talking about, well, mostly whatever I want. The history of Genshin, characters that were more powerful in their prime, things that particularly bother me, whether it be Abyss, story, gameplay, or etc. It really depends on how I'm feeling in that moment.
And we are going to be talking about the worst units in Genshin's history with certain snapshots of when they were bad. For example, spoiler warning, Dehya is a character that is honestly pretty solid now, but on release, So we are essentially going to take characters and decide who has had the lowest lows in the meta, and on the Leech's channel, his video is going to be on who had the highest highs in Genshin's history. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. And with that, let's begin.
Oh Jesus, what do I even say about Aloy? She's bad. Like, really bad. Aloy is a cryo DPS hyper carry with a typical nuke burst, but here's the problem with Aloy as a whole. She's kinda useless. The main problem with her kit is Aloy as a whole is an infusion based DPS that has a problem getting her infusion up. In order to get said infusion, you need to throw a bomb cluster which on contact with an enemy will explode into a flurry of tiny bullets. Once these bullets are pressed on by either an enemy step or thrown into their body with an animo skill, they will take a touch of cryo damage and Aloy will gain a stack. Once you gain a set amount of these stacks, Aloy will finally go into her elemental infusion state, allowing her to deal cryo-aligned auto attacks for a set period of time. Here's the thing though, her damage is dog shit. I tried desperately to make Aloy work, got her all the way up to level 80, put her on the hunter set, scaled her all the way with the best supports I could with Farina, Kazuha, which now would be Zillanen, and of course Bennett, and even then, she was just not doing enough damage. The highest number I ever saw on her was 26k, and on the highest number I saw on her burst was 110k. But it's really hard to actually properly test Aloy due to a mechanic I haven't yet talked about. Her elemental bombs have an ICD on them, which in and of itself doesn't sound that bad until you realize that her elemental infusion is inherently tied to these bombs. Unless you reach the minimum number of stacks required, you are not getting your infusion. So a smart person would think, well maybe if I just cluster up all the bombs together, I would immediately go into my infusion state. But you would be wrong, because these bombs, like I said before, have an ICD, and the ICD is just long enough while also being just short enough to make it inconsistent on if you'll get your fusion from swirling or not. There are some times where you will, and there are other times where you will not, meaning you're going to have to throw your bombs and tread enemies through the path of them in order to get full stacks without wasting it. And make no mistake, it is very easy to waste it. And if you do, you are on a 20-second cooldown until you could potentially get another mid-infusion again. For all those reasons, Aloy is, in my opinion, the worst character in the game. Matter of fact, she is so bad that even the developers themselves have scrubbed Aloy from the record books. If you do not have Aloy as a character, there is no way you will know she exists from internal means alone. You will need to search outside of the game to find Aloy's character, which in my mind is divinely comical.
Next, let's talk about release Zhongli, because oh god, this character was a stinker, and I would know as I pulled for him. So currently, at least, Zhongli is actually a good unit because in terms of shielding, his shield is clearly the strongest in the game, and on top of that, compared to other shielders that need artifact sets to offer you an offensive advantage, he just has a free resistance shred baked into his kit, on top of the fact that if you want to build him with damage in mind, he now has some HP scalings to actualize this much easier. Zhongli, when he released, didn't have any of this. To be fair, only the support of things really mattered for Zhongli, in which he didn't have a resistant shred. Geoshields in general didn't have universal damage absorption. They had the properties of other elemental shields to where they only were strong against their own element. Also, during his skill animation, he didn't have interruption resistance, which for a character with such a long skill animation, meant you were just getting smacked around. So he wasn't even a character to where you could just turn your brain off for comfort and you don't have to think about getting damage in return for him hindering your team's damage output. But he hindered your team's damage output even more as he didn't have his resistance shred, on top of having bad defensive utility. There was also the fact that Geo in general wasn't holistically complete at the time. The mono Geo team core didn't really exist at all as Goro wasn't there to hold it together, and this was pre-Husk, pre-Cinnabar Spindle Albedo, who just wasn't doing that much damage. And even though the double Geo core at the time was popular, in hindsight, even back then we were able to build much stronger teams for those characters, we just didn't realize it yet. So we can now look back and see that Zhongli was kind of useless. He didn't shield even though that was the only thing he offered. You were constantly getting staggered before you could even use his abilities, and and the team options you could build with Geo were also just extremely limited at the time. Overall, just not a standout character. HDC, you take the next one.
Albedo is a very interesting character. During his 1.2 debut, Geo wasn't necessarily in a very good spot, with the release of Zhongli in version 1.0 highlighting the main discrepancies with the element as a whole. It lacked proper utility and the ability to get elemental reactions, which, even at the time, made it to where a lot of the most powerful elements were those that could react with things like Melt and Taser and Swirl. That being said, in a pre-buff era, Albedo was not at all impressive. This is down to a few reasons. The main reason being Albedo's kit as a whole is very, very confusing. His elemental burst scales off of attack percent and damage percent values, while his elemental skill mostly only scales off of defensive values. This means it's going to be very difficult for you to actually build a proper Albedo, because no matter what, if you spec into his skill or his burst, you're going to be missing out on something. Not only that, Albedo really didn't have a lot of powerful weapons at the time. Albedo's signature weapon is the Summit Shaper, which is an attack scaling sword that released at the same time as Albedo. However, it doesn't take a lot of foresight to see that this weapon is not very good on the man. This is mostly down to its attack percent scaling, which really doesn't help it in the grand scheme of things. This means that if you were using Albedo, you were going to be using the man on either the Harbinger of Dawn, which at the time was his best 3-star option, or the limited time event reward being the Festering Desire, which gave him access to energy recharge in exchange for crit rate and crit damage, which wasn't really that useful. He also really didn't have access to a full artifact set, meaning a lot of people would usually put Noblesse Oblige on him, some sort of Geo buffing set, and then some sort of defense buffing set. Archaic Petra coming to mind immediately, but its 4-piece didn't really buff him that significantly either. Based on a look at his kit, specifically his passive talent, which allows him to buff Elemental Mastery upon casting its burst, it's highly likely that he was supposed to be an Archaic Petra support character that did off-field DPS while giving you access to the Crystallize reaction. And when crystallizing a specific elemental shield, you would receive a damage bonus upon claiming the shard. However, with the Geo rework, he pretty much entirely lost this mechanic, and on his initial release, it wasn't really valuable enough to make Albedo worth using. On top of that, he released in the Morgana era of Genshin Impact, with Ganyu's release being right around the corner, Zhao's release, and Hu Tao's release already being confirmed upon his debut. Even support-wise, he wasn't that good, with his competition being Venti and obviously Tartaglia, with the international team being really good in this era. In my eyes, this makes Albedo one of the least powerful units in all of Genshin's history.
Do I have to? Are you really going to make me slander my girl on video? Next up, we have current day Eula. You Yoimiya mains are so lucky. I feel like everything about my girl has already been said, but to summarize, I guess Eula falls prey to having quite low damage, and compared to other carries who have gotten buffs or characters that synergize well with them, Eula teams have barely improved since her release, physical has received barely any support, and Eula's kit is just littered with gameplay issues across the board. And for reference for how badly she's been eclipsed in terms of damage ceiling, a single Mualani normal attack is just out-damaging my Eula's burst entirely. Eula's burst is half of her damage. Mualani's normal attack is 1/4 of hers, and she does it on shorter rotations as well. Branching off of that actually, for her gameplay issues, the biggest one is going to be her absurd energy requirements. She's an 80 energy cost that has to use her burst every rotation due to how much of her damage it is, but she also can't build too much energy as then you're eating into her actual damaging substats. So to compensate, most of her teammates have to run Favonius, and you also have to build a cryo battery just to make her energy needs bearable. The problem is that a lot of the best characters in the game happen to not be cryo units. Citlali will save us trust, but to be fair, Mika and Rosaria do wonders for her, especially Mika after Furina's release, but that gives only a few solid team options on a character that is doing less damage than almost every single carry in the game currently. The other big problem with Eula is the fact that she's backloaded, meaning that most of her damage peaks towards the end of your rotation instead of the start. This kind of sucks. Or well, it's not good in Eula's case, as unlike someone like Linny, she takes way longer for her backloaded hit to come out, and Linny also does like double her damage, and you have more control of when his backloaded hits goes off. When you burst with Eula, not only do you have a timer until your sword explodes, you also have to execute her combos to build up the damage the burst does. Thankfully, Eula doesn't get staggered, but this is just awkward in actual gameplay. Just forget getting a decent amount of stacks if the boss can move slightly. In multi-wave content, if you clear the first wave of enemies, you may not be able to reach the next wave until her burst burst drops. Eula doesn't run groupers on her teams and her burst radius isn't wide enough to compensate for this. It's also extremely difficult to reapply superconduct in multi-wave. Her burst is half of her damage, so you really need to crit with it or she struggles to meet damage breakpoints without high investment. So to conclude, Eula has received very little support, is extremely annoying to play due to her backloaded nature, does less damage than a majority of carries and has half of that underwhelming damage tied to an extremely missable elemental burst, with a character that can't run a grouper. Moving on.
Dehya. Where do I even begin? As of now, Dehya is nowhere near as horrible as people used to say, but Dehya on release is just as bad as people used to say. As a matter of fact, I would argue she is significantly worse. Dehya, to begin with, has split scaling on HP and attack percent, two stats which are so inherently contrastially against one another that it is very hard to build any significant amount of damage percent on Dehya. In order to actually make her damage at least comparable to some of the other 5 stars in the game, you're going to need to grab her C1, which makes HP scaling a little bit more viable. From there, you're going to want to build HP percent in order to actually deal decent damage while speccing into crit rate and crit damage. But here's the thing, she's also not really meant to be a DPS, because the only time she's actually dealing impressive damage, heavy air quotes on that by the way, is when she's in her elemental burst form, meaning most of the time she's on field, she's going to be casting her skill. So what does her skill do? Well, it is some sort of sustainable buff, which makes it to where a percentage of the damage you take is instead absorbed into the totem while giving you resistance to interruption. Awesome, that is incredible. So now I have a character who is split scaling from being a sustain who scales off HP and a DPS who scales off attack and HP, meaning no matter what you build into her, you're not really going to be doing a significant amount of damage or having a significant amount of sustain for her to actually be useful at C0, which means the other role people tried to make Dehya work into was an elemental mastery scaling character that would rely on Burgeon as a whole. Yeah, well, that one didn't really work out that well, because Dehya's elemental skill doesn't have 100% uptime, and even when the time it is on field with its 60% uptime, you're only getting 4 procs of Pyro once every 3 seconds, which means she underperforms even when compared to a character like Thoma, who is able to more efficiently get you burning, which in turn gets you higher damage, while also giving you enough survivability in the form of Thoma's snacking shield effects to make him just significantly more valuable than Dehya on release. And you gotta remember that Thoma was considered bad, and then Dehya came out and was worse than Thoma. And Dehya is a 5-star. Now, she has gotten better as time has gone on, but that doesn't change the fact that Dehya as a whole is one of Genshin's worst characters.
Okay, unlike Eula, I'm actually happy to show on this character because I hate children, and I even have a whole video dedicated to roasting her. You're going to be talking about current Sigewinne because somehow from her release, which was as well received as the thick of it.
I'm in the thick of it, everybody knows. They know me where it snows, I skied in and they froze.
This character over the few patches she's been in the game has already gotten worse and become a more worthless character, which I did not think was possible. To quickly go over her kit, Sigewinne is a healer, her skill would create a bubble that will bounce a few times healing your team each time, and it is actually a lot of healing so she does fulfill her purpose, don't worry, but then her elemental burst is practically a non-factor, just going on field to deal hydro damage. Also, after using her elemental skill, she gives your entire team a flat buff that boosts off-field skill damage, giving her synergy with Furina. Now to talk about her issues, I think the first one is that for a healer who's supposed to be used alongside Furina, she doesn't really do anything to actually warrant a lot of use cases with her. If you take a look at Jean, even though she's also just a healer, she offers something super valuable being Verdescent. Sigewinne only offers you her flat buff, which isn't a lot of damage, and it only works for off-field skill damage dealers, so there isn't even any funny synergies you can do with the on Navia teams, for example. Miss Melusine just doesn't offer a lot compared to other healers, which led her to be very lackluster, but she did have a place in one team being Mono Hydra subs over Kokomi, as it would allow you to on-field Yulon who could benefit from her own A4, and Yulon also just outdamaged Kokomi while on field. But now, Shalonen just exists, removing her from Mono Hydra subs entirely. You can just run a team of Yulon, Furina, Shalonen, and Kazuha, still get some decent healing from Shalonen, as well as her damage amplification from her skill and the scroll set. Shalonen being single target does mean you won't max out Fanfare as fast, but as with what I've said extensively about single target healers, as long as they provide enough benefits to them being single target, which Shalonen more than does, no max maxing out fanfare isn't the end of the world. And this team doesn't really need a dedicated on-fielder, so you can cycle between characters to heal all of them. This isn't even Shalonen's only good team either, whereas it's one of the only good ones for Sigewinne. So currently at least, she just doesn't really bring anything new to the table that other healers don't. And her only unique trait of being able to buff off-field skill damage is overall just not as good offensively as having Verdescent or just Shalonen with the scroll set. So for that, Sigewinne is just in one of the worst states possible, especially for a limited character. We also were going to put Chi-Chi on the list somewhere, but that would be like beating a dead horse, so honorable mention I guess. And with that, the list is concluded. Thank you guys so much for watching. Go watch HGC's video on his channel where we talk about the best in history, as well as thanks to him for coming on as well. He got the less harsh video, so I can already tell what my comments are going to look like, and if you disagree, let me know down below. Still though, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts, as I'd love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. So I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.